My name is Marlo. I just landed at Logan International, the Boston air biting at my skin the moment I stepped off the plane. I'd spent the last year in Singapore, staring at balance sheets and tracking ghost profits for a firm that didn't sleep. My suitcase was still zipped, my coat was still draped over my arm, and my only goal was to get to our family beach house in Maine to finally hear the sound of the tide instead of a humming server room. I pulled my phone from my pocket as the jet bridge connected. The screen lit up with a single notification that made the floor feel like it was tilting. Leo sold the family beach house for $5 million. Thanks for being abroad. I stopped dead in my tracks. A traveler behind me cursed as he swerved to avoid hitting me, but I didn't hear him. I didn't feel the thrum of the airport or the heavy humidity of my own breath. I just felt a sudden, hollow silence. $5 million. The exact valuation of the estate. And a thanks that felt like a serrated knife. My hands didn't shake. Instead, they went unnervingly still, my fingers locking around the phone until my knuckles turned white. I am a forensic auditor. I am trained to find the rot hidden beneath the polished surface. My first instinct wasn't to scream, it was to look for the lie. But the text didn't look like a joke. It looked like a victory lap. 3 hours later, the taxi pulled up to the gates of the main property. The salt air usually smelled like peace, but today it smelled like sawdust and fresh primer. I stood at the end of the driveway, my heels sinking into the gravel, watching my childhood being dismantled in real time. There were realtor signs staked into the lawn, bold, aggressive sold banners flapping in the wind. A massive industrial dumpster sat where my father's workbench used to be, overflowing with the guts of the house, weather-beaten chairs, old rugs, and the floral curtains my mother had sewn by hand. I watched two strangers, a couple in expensive activewear, walk across the wraparound deck. They were pointing at the Atlantic, nodding to a woman in a sharp blazer who was marking things off on a tablet. They moved with the easy entitlement of people who had just bought their way into a legacy. They were touching the hand-carved railings as if they were just another line item in a renovation budget. I stood there, a ghost on my own land, absorbing the shock. The ancient ivy had been ripped from the stone. The front door, once a welcoming deep blue, had been stripped bare. Leo thought he was a genius. He thought that by waiting until I was 10,000 miles away on a long-term contract, he could bypass the one person who knew the legal architecture of this family better than he knew his own reflection. He thought the distance made him untouchable. I didn't call him. I didn't storm onto the porch to confront the new owners. I simply reached into my bag and felt the weight of the encrypted drive tucked inside. Leo didn't just sell a house. He opened a door that he can't close, and he has no idea that I'm already standing on the other side with a paper trail that leads straight to a courtroom. You're right. Part 1 ended with Marlo standing by the mailbox, and Part 2 jumped to her already being halfway up the driveway with a suitcase. Let's smooth that transition so the physical movement and the internal realization flow naturally. The weight of the encrypted drive in my bag felt like a lead weight, a silent anchor as I finally let go of the mailbox and took my first step onto the gravel. The crunch under my heels was louder than I remembered, echoing against the salt-bleached shingles of a house that no longer belonged to me. My suitcase rattled behind me, the wheels catching on a stray piece of crown molding that had been tossed onto the lawn like common trash. A man in a hard hat stepped out of the front door, carrying a bundle of copper pipes. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't even look at me. To him, I was just a woman in a suit who had taken a wrong turn, not the rightful mistress of the estate he was currently gutting. I reached the porch and stopped. The locks were new. The old brass hardware, the ones that required a specific jiggle of the key that only my father and I knew, had been replaced by a sleek, digital keypad. It looked like a scar on the wood. A woman in a navy blazer stepped out, her heels clicking with a sharp, professional rhythm. She was the one I'd seen earlier with the clipboard. When she saw me, she flashed a practiced, expensive smile. "Are you from the staging company?" she asked, checking her watch. "You're a bit early. We aren't finished with the structural audit." "I'm not with the staging company," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the tremor I felt in my chest. "I'm just looking at the house. It's a beautiful piece of history." The realtor beamed, leaning against the doorframe of a house she had no right to stand in. "Isn't it? A rare find. $5 million, cash. Closed in record time, too." The previous owner was very motivated to move the asset while his sister was out of the country. Apparently, she didn't want the burden of the upkeep. I felt a cold, Sharp prickle at the back of my neck. Motivated. Burden. Leo had really done his homework on the script. He hadn't just stolen the equity, he had assassinated my character to smooth the sale. It must have been a complicated closing, I said, tilting my head. A family trust like this usually requires quite a bit of documentation. Multiple signatures, notarized affidavits. The realtor waved a hand dismissively. It was surprisingly clean. Everything was in order. Power of attorney, digital signatures, the works. The brother, Leo, had every T crossed and every I dotted. Most sellers are a nightmare, but he made it easy. She checked her tablet, already moving on to her next task. We're actually starting the interior gutting on Monday. The new owners want an open concept. They're tearing out the library walls. The library. That was where my father's first editions lived. It was where the original trust documents had been drafted. I looked past her into the foyer. I could see the outlines on the wallpaper where our family photos used to hang. They were gone. The house felt hollow, a body with its soul surgically removed. I didn't tell her who I was. As a forensic auditor, I knew that the moment I revealed my identity, the shutters would go down. The paperwork would be hidden. The lawyers would circle the wagons. I needed to see those clean documents first. I needed to see whose hand had guided the pen. I'm sure the new owners will be very happy, I said. I turned and walked back down the steps, my suitcase trailing behind me like a witness. I could feel the realtor's eyes on my back for a moment before she went back to her tablet. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Another text from Leo. Leo, hope you're enjoying the jet lag. Don't worry about the house, I took care of everything. Check your personal account. I sent you a little something for your troubles. I didn't check the account. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what he'd sent, a fraction of the theft, a bribe disguised as a gift. I reached the gate and looked back at the house one last time. Leo thought he had won because the money was in the bank and the locks were changed. He didn't realize that I wasn't coming for the house. I was coming for the paper trail. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't even stop for coffee. I drove straight to the county registrar's office, a squat, brick building that smelled of floor wax and old paper. This was where the truth lived. In my line of work, people can lie, but the ink usually tells a different story. The office was quiet, the only sound the low hum of a desktop fan and the distant clicking of a keyboard. I stood at the high wooden counter until a woman with silver-rimmed glasses looked up from a stack of files. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the practiced patience of someone who spent their days dealing with frustrated title agents. "I need to pull the recent deed transfer for 44 Ocean Way," I said. "And any associated power of attorney filings from the last 90 days. She nodded, turning to her terminal. The clicking of the keys felt like a countdown. "That's the Miller property. It just closed last week. High-profile sale." "I know," I replied. She disappeared into the back for a few minutes and returned with a thin manila folder. She slid it across the counter. "Since it's a public record, you're welcome to review it here. Copies are $1 a page." I opened the folder. The first page was the warranty deed. There it was, in black and white, $5 million. The seller was listed as the Miller Family Trust. I flipped to the second page. This was the document that had allowed the sale to happen without my physical presence. A limited power of attorney, granting Leo Miller the authority to execute all documents related to the sale of the real estate. At the bottom of the page, I saw my name. Marlo Miller. The signature was a masterpiece. It had the same slight tilt to the M that I've had since high school. It had the precise, sharp tail on the O that I only use when I'm in a hurry. To any untrained eye, it was perfect. I looked at the date. October 14th. "The notary who witnessed this," I said, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "Is there a record of where this was signed?" The clerk leaned over, squinting at the embossed seal. "Let's see. It says here it was notarized in person at the law offices of Sterling and Associates. They're just a few blocks over." "In person," I repeated. On October 14th, I had been in a boardroom in Singapore, finishing a 14-hour audit of a logistics firm. I had the passport stamps, the flight logs, and the digital login records to prove I was on the other side of the planet. Leo hadn't just forged a signature. He had hired someone to walk into a law office and pretend to be me. He had recruited an actress to play the role of his sister so he could liquidate our family's history. Is there a problem, honey? The clerk asked, noticing the way I was staring at the page. No, I said, closing the folder and sliding it back to her. The paperwork looks very professional. I walked out of the office and stood on the sidewalk, the cold Maine wind whipping around me. I could have called the police right then. I could have walked into Sterling and Associates and demanded to see their security footage. But as a forensic auditor, I knew that a cornered rat always finds a hole to crawl into. If I moved too fast, Leo would move the money. He would hide the $5 million in offshore accounts or crypto wallets before I could freeze a single cent. I needed to see the bank records first. I needed to see exactly where that $5 million landed. I checked my phone. Leo had sent another text, blissfully unaware that I was standing 3 blocks away from the evidence of his felony. Leo, let me know when you've checked your account. We should do dinner when you're back in town. My treat. I didn't reply. I just started walking toward the local bank branch where our trust account had been held for 30 years. I sat in my car outside the bank, the heater blasting but doing nothing to thaw the chill in my bones. I had just come from the records office, and the image of my forged signature was burned into my retinas. My phone buzzed again in the cup holder. Leo was persistent. He wanted that thank you. He wanted the validation that he had finally outsmarted the big sister who always had the answers. Leo, seriously, Marlo, check the account. You're set for life. I did us both a favor. I looked at the text and thought back to the way we had operated for the last decade. After our parents passed, we fell into a rhythm. I was the one who handled the high-level finances, the taxes, and the offshore compliance from my office in Singapore. Leo was the one on the ground in Maine. He managed the details, hiring the landscapers, fixing the leaky roof, and playing the role of the dutiful local son. Because he handled the day-to-day, he grew to believe he owned the foundation. He always felt overlooked, the little brother playing house while I made the real money. I could see it in his eyes every Christmas, a simmering resentment that he had to ask me for permission to use trust funds for renovations that usually looked a lot like luxury car leases. He thought he was safe because he'd spent years watching me. He figured that if he presented a clean file and a massive payout, I'd be too blinded by the money to care about the ethics. He assumed my greed would match his own. But he forgot one thing. I don't just audit strangers. Years ago, when Leo's gambling debts first surfaced and I had to bail him out of a hole that nearly swallowed his inheritance, I didn't just give him a lecture. I put safeguards in place. I quietly moved the primary trust credentials to a secondary, non-disclosed entity. I set up tripwires in the accounts, small, innocuous alerts that would trigger if certain thresholds were met without a hardware token authorization. He thought he had control because he had the keys to the front door and a friendly relationship with the local notary. He didn't realize I had rewired the entire alarm system while he was busy picking out the drapes. His arrogance was his blind spot. He truly believed that because I was 10,000 miles away, I was a ghost. He thought that by the time I landed, the gift of $2.5 million in my account would make me an accomplice after the fact. I finally opened my banking app. There it was. A transfer of $2.5 million sat in my personal savings account, labeled simply, family gift. It was a trap. By accepting the money, I would be signaling my consent to the sale. If I spent a single dollar, a defense attorney would later argue that I was a willing participant in the transaction. I didn't touch it. I didn't even move it to a high-yield account. I left it sitting there like a radioactive isotope. I put the car in gear and drove to a small, quiet diner on the edge of town to meet Sarah, a high-stakes litigator who specialized in white-collar asset recovery. I needed a legal shark to match my financial scalpel. As I pulled into the diner lot, another message flashed. Leo, why the silence, Ma? I know you've seen the balance. Don't tell me you're going to be difficult about a $5 million payday. I stared at the screen until it went black. He wasn't just arrogant, he was certain. He had spent months, maybe years, convincing himself that I was the obstacle to his wealth. Now that he had removed the obstacle, he expected me to thank him for the debris. I gently moved his hand off my shoulder. I sat down in the only empty chair, right in the middle of the long table. I didn't reach for the wine. I didn't open the menu. You sold a house that was in an irrevocable trust, Leo, I said quietly. The table went still. Leo's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of brotherly concern. Ma, don't start with the auditor talk. Not here. We're celebrating. I had the power of attorney. I had the signatures. Everything was legal. The title company cleared it, and the buyers are already moving in. She's just tired from the flight, Leo, Aunt Martha chimed in, patting my hand. Marlo, honey, don't be difficult. It's $5 million. Think of what you can do with that. You should be thanking him for taking the initiative while you were busy in Singapore. I looked around the table. They saw a hero. They saw a man who had liberated them from the burden of a drafty old house and replaced it with the promise of family stability. They didn't see the forged signatures. They didn't see Marcus Thorne, the bail bondsman witness. They didn't see the shell company. Leo sensed the room was on his side. He leaned back, spreading his arms wide. Look, if Marlo wants to be bitter because she wasn't the one to sign the final papers, that's on her. But the deal is done. The money is in the bank. The house is gone. Let it go, March. Let it go, I whispered. I looked at Leo. He was so sure of himself. He thought that because he had successfully manipulated our family, he had won the war. He thought social pressure would force me into silence. He didn't realize that while he was busy buying this dinner, Sarah was finishing the paperwork for a different kind of meeting. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small, white envelope. I didn't open it. I just set it on the table next to his wine glass. What's this? Leo asked, his voice dropping the jovial tone. A thank you card. It's a notice of a freeze on the ML Heritage Holdings account, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. And a summons. We have a hearing on Tuesday morning regarding the fraudulent sale of the property. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It wasn't polite. It was heavy, suffocating. Leo's face turned a shade of grey that matched the primer on the beach house walls. Marlo, what are you doing? Jenna hissed. You're suing your own brother. I'm not suing him for the house, I said, standing up. I looked at Leo, whose hand was now visibly shaking as he reached for the envelope. I'm letting the state decide how many years a forged power of attorney is worth. Tuesday at 9 a.m., Leo. Don't be late. I'd hate for the judge to start the deposition without you. I walked out of the room without looking back. Behind me, the shouting started, but for the first time since I landed, the noise didn't matter. The board was set. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, filled with the smell of old wood and the low hum of an air conditioner that couldn't quite handle the humidity. Leo sat at the defense table, flanked by a lawyer who looked like he spent more time at the golf course than the law library. Leo was leaning back, whispering something that made his attorney chuckle. He still had the air of a man who thought he was merely settling a family squabble. My attorney, Sarah, sat beside me in perfect stillness. Her laptop wasn't even open. She just had a single manila folder placed precisely in the center of the table. All rise, the bailiff intoned. Judge Holloway entered. She was a woman who had seen every trick in the book, with eyes that seemed to weigh the truth before a single word was spoken. She glanced at the docket and then looked over her spectacles at the room. We are here regarding the emergency motion to freeze assets and the challenge to the sale of 44 Ocean Way, Holloway began. Mr. Miller, your counsel has filed a brief stating the sale was executed under a valid power of attorney. Is that the defense's position? Leo's lawyer stood up, smoothing his tie. That is correct, Your Honor. My client acted in the best interest of the family trust. The property was a liability. The sale was clean, the funds have been distributed, and we believe this is simply a case of sibling seller's remorse. Leo nodded, casting a sympathetic look toward me, as if I were the one who was confused. It was a performance he had clearly rehearsed. Ms. Miller, the judge turned to Sarah. Sarah stood up. She didn't use a microphone. She didn't need to. Your Honor, the document in question is a limited power of attorney dated October 14th. It bears the signature of my client, Marlo Miller. We have 2 points of contention. First, the signature is a forgery. Second, and more importantly, the document was physically impossible to execute. Leo's lawyer scoffed. A signature expert can argue all day, Your Honor, but the document was notarized in person. Unless the plaintiff is claiming she has a twin she didn't mention, she was there. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Miller, do you have evidence to support the claim of forgery? I have something better, Your Honor, Sarah said. She opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I have a certified copy of the Singapore Customs and Border Entry logs, along with a verified flight manifest from Singapore Airlines. On October 14th, at 4:45 p.m., the exact time this document was notarized in Maine, my client was passing through security at Changi Airport, 10,000 miles away. The room went silent. I watched Leo. The smug tilt of his head vanished. He shifted in his seat, his eyes darting to his lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in his own notes. The defense claims the signature was notarized in person, Sarah continued, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. Which means either my client discovered the secret to teleportation, or the notary at Sterling & Associates witnessed a woman who was not Marlo Miller sign that document. The judge turned her gaze toward Leo. It was a look that could have stripped paint. Mr. Miller, Judge Holloway said, her voice dropping to a dangerously low volume. The court is looking at a notarized document that places your sister in two places at once. This isn't a matter of seller's remorse anymore. This is a matter of a fraudulent filing in my jurisdiction. Leo opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the judge, then at me. The silence in the courtroom stretched, heavy and suffocating. Who, the judge asked, each word deliberate, was the woman you brought to the law office on October 14th? Leo didn't answer. He looked down at the table, the confidence finally draining out of him, leaving behind nothing but the pale, shaking ghost of a man who realized he had run out of lies. The silence in the courtroom was no longer the respectful kind. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a trap snapping shut. I sat with my spine pressed against the wooden chair, watching the color leave Leo's face. Judge Holloway didn't look away from him. She tapped her pen twice on the bench, the sound echoing like a gavel. Mr. Miller, the judge repeated, I am asking you a direct question. If your sister was in Singapore at 4:45 p.m. on October 14th, who did you present to the notary as Marlo Miller? Leo's lawyer stood up, his movements jerky. Your Honor, my client may have been confused about the specific timeline. It's possible the document was signed earlier and held in. The document is timestamped, the judge interrupted, her voice like ice. It is digitally notarized. There is no held in escrow for a physical appearance. Either the notary lied, or your client provided a body to fill that chair. Sarah stood up slowly. Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit C. It is a sworn affidavit from Marcus Thorne, the witness listed on the power of attorney. He was taken into custody this morning on an unrelated matter. In exchange for leniency, he has identified the woman present at the signing. Leo's head snapped towards Sarah. His eyes were wide, panicked. This was the one thing he hadn't prepared for, the loyal witness flipping to save his own skin. The woman was a local actress, Sarah continued, her voice echoing in the rafters. She was paid $10,000 from a private account belonging to Leo Miller to wear a wig, carry a fake ID, and sign my client's name. A gasp went up from the small gallery behind us. Aunt Martha was there, her hand over her mouth, her eyes darting between me and Leo. The family hero was dissolving in real time. This is a farce, Leo finally choked out, finding his voice. Marlo, tell them. You wanted the money. You're just doing this because you want a bigger cut. I don't want the money, Leo, I said, speaking for the first time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. I want the house back. And I want the truth. Judge Holloway didn't wait for more. She signaled to the bailiff. This court is no longer in session for a civil motion. Based on the evidence of forgery and the redirection of trust assets to a shell company, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. She looked at Leo, her expression one of pure disdain. Mr. Miller, you are to remain in this building. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Miller to the holding area while the DA's office processes the warrants for grand larceny and identity theft. Leo's lawyer tried to protest, but it was like trying to stop a landslide with a silk tie. Two officers stepped toward the defense table. Marlo. Leo yelled as they gripped his arms. Marlo, we're family. You can't do this. You're going to destroy everything. I watched as the handcuffs clicked shut over his expensive watch. I watched the man who had bragged about handling the details get led out through the side door. The courtroom cleared out quickly, leaving only me, Sarah, and the heavy silence of the wood-paneled room. The victory didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like an autopsy. It's not over, Sarah said, closing her laptop. The house is still in the hands of the buyers. The money is still in the shell company. Now we have to claw it all back. I looked at the empty chair where my brother had Saturday. The legal battle had been won in 20 minutes, but the wreckage was going to take years to clear. What's next? I asked. Now, Sarah said, we go to the bank. And we make sure they understand that if they don't cooperate, they're the next ones I'm putting in front of Holloway. The following morning, the salt air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and reality. I stood on the sidewalk across from the beach house, watching a local sheriff's deputy staple a neon orange notice to the gate. It was a lease pendens, a formal notice that the property was subject to a legal claim. The new owners, the couple in the expensive activewear I had seen days ago, were standing in the driveway. They weren't nodding at the view anymore. The woman was shouting into her phone, her face flushed with panic, while the man stared at the sheriff as if he were speaking a foreign language. I'm sorry, sir, the deputy said, his voice carrying in the quiet morning. But until the court determines the validity of the deed, no further work can be done on this structure. You are advised to contact your title insurance immediately. I watched them realize that their $5 million dream was currently a crime scene. They had paid for a legacy, but Leo had sold them a lawsuit. Sarah pulled up beside me, her window rolling down. The bank accounts are frozen, she said. The $2.5 million in your account is being held in escrow by the court, and the other half, the portion Leo was busy spending, has been clawed back from his brokerage account. He'd already lost $80,000 on bad trades in 48 hours. I didn't feel the surge of triumph I expected. I just felt tired. What are the charges? Grand larceny in the first degree, identity theft, and 4 counts of offering a false instrument for filing, Sarah replied. Because he used a shell company to move the funds across state lines, the DA is talking to federal prosecutors about wire fraud. Leo isn't looking at a fine, Marlo. He's looking at a decade. My phone buzzed. It was a flurry of messages from the family. The tone had shifted. The celebratory mood of the steakhouse was gone, replaced by a desperate, frantic circling of the wagons. Aunt Martha, Marlo, you have to drop this. He's your brother. He made a mistake, but you can't let him go to prison. Think of the family name. Cousin Jenna, you're being cruel. You have the money. Why do you need to destroy him too? Is the house really worth his life? I looked at the messages and felt nothing but a cold, clinical distance. They weren't worried about the theft, they were worried about the shame. They were comfortable with the crime as long as the payout was quiet. But now that the sheriff was at the door and the Miller name was in the police blotter, I was the villain for holding up a mirror. He didn't just make a mistake, I whispered to the empty air. He choreographed a heist. I looked back at the house. The contractors were packing up their tools. The circular saws went silent. The open concept renovation was dead. The library walls, where my father's history lived, would stay standing for now. What about the actress? I asked Sarah. She's talking, Sarah said. She's a local theater student who thought she was helping a rightful owner bypass a bitter, estranged sister who was holding a family inheritance hostage. Leo told her I was the one trying to steal the house. He played the victim until the very end. I turned away from the property. I didn't want to see the orange signs or the angry buyers. I wanted to go back to the hotel and sleep for a week. But I knew the hardest part wasn't the law, it was the silence that followed. Tell the DA I'll testify, I said. Every date, every flight log, every decimal point. I want the record to be perfect. I wasn't just an auditor anymore. I was the architect of his consequences. The Maine coast was beginning to thaw, the ice receding from the shoreline in jagged, translucent sheets. It had been 6 months since I landed at Logan with a suitcase full of jet lag and a phone full of betrayal. I sat in the library of the beach house, the one the new owners had intended to demolish. The wallpaper still had the faint, rectangular outlines where our family photos had hung, but I hadn't put them back up yet. The room was mostly empty, smelling of cedar and salt. The legal process hadn't been a movie-style sprint. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of depositions, bank freezes, and character assassinations. The family gift of $2.5 million had long since been clawed back by the court. The buyers had been made whole by their title insurance, though they still looked at me with a mixture of pity and resentment whenever they saw me in town. I hadn't seen Leo since the day of the hearing, but I saw him now through the glass of a partition in the county facility. He looked different. The tan was gone, replaced by the sallow, greyish hue of someone who hadn't felt the sun on his face in months. He had lost weight. The expensive suit had been replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit that made his shoulders look narrow and slumped. He didn't look like a mastermind. He just looked like a man who had gambled on his sister's silence and lost. "Are you happy now?" he asked. His voice was thin, muffled by the intercom. "I'm not anything, Leo," I said. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, or perhaps a lingering heat of anger. I had rehearsed speeches about the sanctity of our parents' wishes and the mechanics of the law. But looking at him, the words felt heavy and unnecessary. "You're going to lose the house eventually anyway," he spat, a flicker of his old arrogance sparking in his eyes. "You can't afford the taxes without the trust money I was trying to generate. I was trying to save us. I took a local auditing contract," I told him. "I'm staying here. The house stays. The decimals work out if you don't spend $80,000 on a single weekend in Vegas." He looked away, his jaw tightening. He was still waiting for me to apologize for being the one who caught him. He was still waiting for me to be the big sister who fixed his messes. "I won't be coming back for a while, Leo," I said, standing up. "Marlo, wait." I didn't wait. I didn't look back as the heavy door buzzed and clicked shut behind me. The family had mostly stopped calling. Aunt Martha had sent a card at Christmas, but the inside was blank, a silent acknowledgement that the bridge had been burned from both ends. I was the person who put her own brother in prison. He was the person who stole his sister's life. Neither of us was a hero in the stories they told at dinner now. I drove back to the house and walked out onto the wraparound deck. The Atlantic was a deep, restless blue. I realized then that I hadn't won anything. I had simply protected a pile of wood and stone from a man who saw it as a currency. The house was quiet, unnervingly quiet, but for the first time in my life, it was mine. Not as a trustee, not as a manager, but as a survivor of my own history. I went inside and closed the door, the old brass latch clicking into place with a familiar, solid sound. I spent my first evening in the house alone, sitting on the floor of the empty library. The contractors had taken the furniture, and the court had taken the money, leaving me with nothing but the architecture. As I sat there, I realized that everyone, the realtor, the buyers, the family, and especially Leo, kept talking about the $5 million. They saw the house as a number. They saw the betrayal as a transaction with a high cost. Even I had spent months treating it like a forensic puzzle, a series of forged signatures and broken tripwires. But as the sun began to set over the Atlantic, painting the library walls in a deep, bruised purple, I finally understood what Leo had really lost. It wasn't his freedom, and it wasn't the money. He had lost the ability to be a memory. This house was built on the idea that we were a collective, a chain of people who looked after one another. By trying to sell it, Leo hadn't just stolen an asset, he had deleted himself from the lineage. He had traded his seat at the table for a temporary balance in a bank account. He had looked at 40 years of shared summers and decided they were worth exactly $2.5 million. I walked over to the corner of the room where the height markings were still etched into the doorframe. There was my name, and 6 inches below it, his. Those marks were the only thing the renovators hadn't managed to strip away. I took a pocket knife from my bag. For a moment, I thought about carving his name out, erasing the last physical trace of the man who had tried to gaslight me into a felony. But I stopped. To erase him would be an act of anger. And anger is a connection. I didn't want to be connected to him anymore. I left the marks where they were. They were no longer a record of a brother. They were just scratches on a piece of wood. A measurement of a person who stopped growing a long time ago. I stood on the deck and watched the tide come in. The ocean didn't care about trust deeds or power of attorney. It didn't care about the $5 million. It just kept moving, indifferent to the small, greedy dramas of the people on the shore. Leo thought he was clever because he knew how to manipulate the system. He thought I was weak because I followed the rules. But he forgot that the rules are the only thing that keep the walls from falling down. I am Marlo Miller. I am an auditor, a sister, and now, the sole keeper of a house that stands in defiance of its own sale. I didn't save the house because I loved the property. I saved it because the truth is the only thing you can't buy back once you've sold it. Leo is left with the money he couldn't keep. I am left with the silence he couldn't stand. In the end, we both got exactly what we valued most. He got the price, and I got the value.